Well, we're heading over to Garagemahall to play with trees, painted trees. We're painting trees onto the backdrop for the 120.3 scale railroad. And Robbie's coming over again. Robbie, as always, paints a wicked tree. And we're going to try to pick up some tips from him because we're going to be painting our own backdrop for the accidental railroad. She already paints a pretty wicked tree, but maybe we can pick up some tips from Robbie, and you might be able to pick up some tips from Robbie too on how to paint trees onto your backdrop. And then we're going to talk about how to add three-dimensional trees onto your backdrop, because that can really bring the backdrop to life. To just take like a regular tree, cut in half, and stick it to the well, you see what? If you don't get that, you'll catch it as we go forward here. So check this out: adding trees to the backdrop.
Well, if you remember, we did a photographic version of the backdrop in Photoshop to use as a painting guide, and then Robbie came in and painted the first few layers, which included the mountains and some distant pine trees on the mountains. We're working forward in layers now, and we're coming up toward the more foreground trees. There'll even be some trees in front of these trees, but these are pretty much right up at the front, and so they're handled in a different way. Now, as we talked about before, a kind of standard artist's technique, and Robbie uses that too, is to paint dark to light. So he's using black and yellow mixed together to create this really rich dark color. It actually comes in as almost a sort of olive drab military color. Robbie's already done what's called the underpainting, just roughing in this big glob of this same kind of color, indicating where the trees are going to be. It serves two purposes. It kind of lets you know where the trees are going to be, but it also provides a layer behind the painting so that the backdrop doesn't show through, because these colors can be rather transparent as they go on. Again, we are working with artists' acrylics, and another thing to keep in mind with those is that they darken as they dry, so you have to let it dry for a minute to see what color you're actually working with. So what Robbie's doing here is he's putting on layer upon layer, adding more and more yellow as he goes, again going dark to light, and keeping in mind that the sun is shining down on these trees from above and slightly to the left as well. So he's painting, letting shadows fall below the masses of leaves and creating depth by adding progressively lighter and lighter colors, still just using this mix of black and yellow. Now Robbie's adding in just a hint of a dark blue to create a green with his yellow, and that's really making these trees three-dimensional. You can really see where the light is shining down on the leaves and letting these shadow areas appear that are dark and mysterious down inside the masses of trees. These are not individual trees. This is just this huge biomass. They'll sort of evolve into individual trees as we go along, but you would never want to paint just individual trees and try to create a forest that way. You want to create just a giant biomass and then let the trees kind of pull themselves out of that. And if you really want to have some freestanding tree, that could be painted on in another layer over the top of all of this. Now, as these layers go down, Robbie's moving to a smaller brush. He started off with a 1-inch brush, and now he's moved to a 1/2-inch brush. Eventually, he'll get down to a really small brush to create something looking more like actual leaves. Robbie's mixing up a lighter color and then applying that over the entire biomass and then letting that dry to see what color he's actually putting down, because it darkens, and then he mixes another color and goes over the entire biomass again, right to left or left to right, but covering the entire biomass, not doing it in sections. Okay, now Robbie's coming back and he's punching holes in the biomass using the sky color, this very light blue. Anywhere the trees extend up above the horizon line, he's punching some holes in here so that the trees feel open and airy. in some of these places there's going to be trunks and branches going through these open areas, and so he's leaving a dark green area there because he doesn't want to put blue underneath where the branches and trunks are going to be. Otherwise, the blue will tend to show through because, again, these colors tend to be sort of transparent. He's also sort of tearing up the top edge so it feels more like individual leaves against the sky and not just a smooth, rounded section. And that looks much better. Here you can see where the branches and trunks are going to cross through these open areas, and again Robbie's leaving the green there so that he has a back painting underneath the trunks and branches when they go down. The first layer of branches and trunks are a very, very dark gray, and then progressively lighter grays are placed over the top of that. Again, always painting dark to light and keeping in mind that the sun is above and to our left, and painting the left side of the branches and trunks with progressively lighter and lighter grays. And while we still have biomass, notice we now have 5 individual trees kind of forming. Robbie's now taking an even lighter gray and putting in some little sort of sparkly texture details on the trunks, even some sort of horizontal lines that really feel like sun hitting on a textured bark. Notice I keep saying gray. A lot of people think tree trunks should be brown, but they actually look much better if they're done in a gray. Browns start to look rather cartoony if you're not careful. Right here, Robbie's pulling one branch out that comes out in front of everything. That's a really neat effect, but you wouldn't want to do it in very many places or it starts looking hokey. But he's just got one dead branch here kind of extending out in front of everything else, and that looks really neat. This color looks really, really bright, but keep in mind it's going to darken as it dries, but he's really adding the highlights in here on the bark texture. Really looks sharp once it dries and darkens in just a bit. Well, just a little while ago, this was a big green drab blob sitting here, and now it looks like a lot of individual trees, an actual forest made out of a whole bunch of different trees. Now Robbie's coming back with a really, really light green. He's using that same gray that he used for the tree trunks so that everything kind of blends together and feels like it's all part of the same painting. But he's mixing in just a little of the green to create this very, very light green for leaf highlights and individual leaves. And he's gone to a very small brush now to just put some sort of sparkly little highlights on individual leaves. It really starts to come to life and really feel three-dimensional. We're not worrying about the very bottom here because a wood fence is going right there. Otherwise, there'd be yet another layer over the top of this with some foreground brush or rocks or sand or something like that. Now, I know a lot of people these days are using photographic backdrops, and if you know how to build one of those can look really, really good and very, very realistic. But I think it's much more interesting to do a painted backdrop. We are, after all, creating some sort of alternate reality with our modeling, and this just ties so much better into that, makes everything feel like an artistic expression. And here we see it with the fence in place. Now, the building isn't actually going to be here. We're just setting that in so we can see if the trees are the right size relative to our scale, and they feel nice and distant, and they do. It all lines up just perfectly. Now, I mentioned earlier that we're going to do some half trees that will stick up against this backdrop, should sit between the fence and the backdrop. I used software here to create some three-dimensional trees, just like I used a photographic backdrop. I like to test things here in the computer so I can figure out where I want to put the trees and if that's going to look right or not. I'm using software here called Lightwave. It's a three-dimensional software, really kind of weird to use, but I'm used to it. I've been using it forever, and I use it for testing a lot of buildings and trees and that sort of thing. But when we get the half trees in, boy, does that make the backdrop look nice and three-dimensional. The tiny amount of space between the track and the backdrop is always some very valuable real estate, and so these flat trees fit right in there.
So hopefully you now feel confident to put trees on a backdrop. I feel confident to put trees on the backdrop.
I don't, not yet.
Well, we're going to play with it. I mean, and that's the thing to do with all of these backdrop painting things is just paint some backdrops that you're not really planning to use as backdrops.
Yeah.
You could go over to Walmart and buy some poster board or some canvas or whatever you feel inspired to buy and paint on it.
And study Picasso.
Well, wait, no, that wouldn't look anything like a tree. That would look sort of like a fish with 7 eyes. It would only be called tree.
Yes.
But, no, mess around with it and experiment with it. And when you finally feel comfortable, go in the living room and paint a backdrop on the wall. It might offend some people, but it might not, and it just depends. If you feel really comfortable with it, though, because every railroad really should have a backdrop. It really enhances the railroad. And the trees are so important to the backdrop that, well, unless, of course, you're doing the desert or potentially Kansas. But
well.
typically, a backdrop will have trees, and so typically this is really important information. As we actually try building our three-dimensional trees and sticking them to the backdrop instead of just using the computer to build those, of course we will share that with you, and we'll see how that works out. For now, we're just experimenting and trying to figure out how to do a flat tree in such a way that it looks convincingly not like a flat tree. And also, flat trees can be used to hide a multitude of sins. And I've been experimenting with that. So in the next show on backdrops, we're going to be looking at adding buildings into the backdrop. And surprisingly, the key to putting buildings on the backdrop is putting trees on the backdrop. Now, that doesn't make any sense. But when you watch the building show, it'll make perfect sense. And hopefully, it'll be just like the eclipse show, that the moon will move away from the sun and light will come on and you'll go, aha! And you go, you'll be all ready to put trees on your backdrop to hide the edges of your buildings. Well, if you haven't been over to the channel, do pop over to the channel and binge watch as much as you can stomach for a while, and then come back and do some more, and like and share and all of those good things. And if you're not a subscriber to the channel, you can subscribe by just clicking on the blue button, which is about to appear. Are you ready for it? Honk! Right there where the horn button is.
I would honk again, but that van has...
Don't scare them. They're already scared.
There's a truck driver who's going to go in and is like... Anyway, yeah.
So the blue button, if you don't see the blue button, it's because your device doesn't support the blue button, and oddly enough, many devices don't anymore. I don't know if they're changing the devices or the YouTube or what, but bit by bit, fewer and fewer things are seeing the blue button. But if you see the blue button, click on it, and it'll make you a subscriber. If you're already a subscriber, it just takes you to the channel. Well, we're not sure how you found this movie on the internet. We hope you didn't find it boring. And we will see you here in a week or possibly less, because we're putting up shows like crazy these days.
Yes.
With some more massive screwing around. See you then. Bye-bye.
Bye.